Hello again, friends. Once more, let's hit some in other news. And there's a story that I find fascinating here that speaks to a whole lot going on in the world that involves the United States, by the way, and our fine men and women in uniform. That's really going to be under the radar in most news sources today. And that is a Friday, April 27th. A deal has been struck that will see the departure of thousands of U.S. troops from, not Iraq, not Afghanistan, from Japan. What? What? Yeah, that's what's going on in other news today. Let's call this one Sayonara to Okinawa. What am I talking about here? Well, this is a deal long in the making. Since World War II, the United States has had tens of thousands of U.S. troops permanently stationed in bases across Japan. Of the 50,000 some odd troops, U.S. troops at permanent U.S. facilities in Japan, almost half of them are in this one place called Okinawa. Go Google that. Look up the map on Okinawa. Okinawa-san. It's a dinky little island, a really kind of a little strip of an island, really far south. It's one of the most southernmost little islands. There's the four main islands of Japan. Then there's a little archipelago way down south, hundreds of miles south of mainland, kind of the main four islands of Japan. And Okinawa is in the southern tip of this southern archipelago chain. As you can imagine, it has some strategic significance, having something on the order of 20,000 U.S. troops there. And on top of just the troops number, mostly Marines, to my knowledge, there's a big U.S. air base there at Futenma, I believe is the pronunciation, Futenma, which is kind of the biggest city in Okinawa. And this Okinawa base, the U.S. Marine presence there, has been a source of aggravation and frustration and friction between the U.S. and Japan for decades. This isn't even a new thing. Being such a small place and having a huge U.S. Marine presence there, and it's the Futenma is an air base, so you have military airplanes going in and out of this place all the time, nonstop, for training and as a layover and for troop transport. So it's a really busy place, and it has been aggravating the Okinawans for years. There has been huge, I won't call it anti-U.S. sentiment, but anti-U.S. base sentiment there for years. There's a history of on-again, off-again bad behavior by U.S. Marines there, where local crimes have been committed. I know a young girl was raped there maybe a decade ago by some Marines. That still sticks in the current memory of a lot of Okinawans. There's a lot of noise, traffic accidents associated with the U.S. presence there. And so the locals, for a long time, this has been a huge, huge bone of contention that a lot of folks in Okinawa have wanted the U.S. presence gone entirely. But it's kind of critical. The U.S. wants to be there. The U.S. actually took control of the island after World War II. I'm not a historian on the Japanese Pacific theater in World War II, but I do know this, that the U.S. kind of took Okinawa over by force, and it was a pitched battle that 100,000 plus Okinawans died in a final last stand when the U.S. invaded the island in the closing days of World War II. So maybe that's part of the friction there as well. It certainly is the reason why there are so many U.S. service personnel there, because it basically became U.S. property for a while. Now that's pushing the description, but you know me, I speak bluntly. So the U.S. kind of controlled this place outright, I think, until the 70s. And big chunks of this island are U.S. bombing facilities and U.S. property and U.S. training facilities. I'm just making a guess here, but I'm thinking it's like a quarter of the whole island is kind of still under U.S. control. So there's been this friction between the locals and the U.S. there for some time that the Japanese and the United States have been trying to sort out. By the way, the Japanese government, as you might imagine, the central government of Japan doesn't have a huge issue with this, because the U.S. bases offer Japan protection. They have since World War II. So it's not a, hey, all of Japan hates the U.S. and wants to get rid of them. No, 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 no. It's more that this is a local problem that the Japanese central government has had to deal with. And they actually, for about a decade now, have said, hey, United States, do you think maybe you guys could move that base or leave that base? It's just really a pain in the ass. And it's finally come to happen. Now, they're not closing down the base. They've been trying to negotiate what to do with the Okinawa base, again, for decades. Specifically, the last 5 years, the U.S. has been like, okay, you guys are obviously really serious about this and really pissed, so what can we do? Because whatever we're going to do, the Japanese government, you guys are going to shoulder part of the cost. The estimated cost is going to be like $9 billion to move this base somewhere else in Japan, or just to move the people out altogether, or to reestablish a new base somewhere else in Japan. And the U.S. has been very outright saying, that's fine, I guess we can work with you, but you're going to pony up $3 or $4 billion of this. Because you know what? We have agreements since World War II where we're buddies with you, we're strong allies, and we have agreements to have all these bases, so you can't just renege now and decide you want to kick us out because it's a local issue. So that's what's been going on. They've been trying to sort out this issue for a long time, and here we are, back to the date, April 27th, Friday, here in 2012, that for the first time in my lifetime, they're going to have a depletion of U.S. forces on this Okinawa base. It's kind of a big deal. I'm sure it's a big deal in Okinawa. Of the 20,000 odd U.S. Marines and other personnel that are there, they said today 9,000 of these people will be going somewhere else. We're going to move them somewhere else. Probably in other bases in Japan, because remember, there are about 50,000 U.S. troops just in Japan. By the way, just across the Sea of Japan over in South Korea, there's like 28,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. We have, for the entire Cold War, been kind of the overseers and protectors of Japan and South Korea, and there's been a huge U.S. presence there. Maybe that presence, it's time for it to be recalibrated and adjusted and moved to other parts of the planet where the U.S. may now have bigger fish to fry, is a way to put it. And I think that's part of what's going on here. I think the U.S. has not caved, but has said, okay, well, you guys have a problem with it, and you know what? We want to kind of reposition U.S. forces in other places that are more critical right now than, say, a small island in Japan. And they're even saying, yes, it doesn't make sense to have 50,000 U.S. troops on this little island, because if we did get into a major battle or major war, and we're talking, of course, about China, if we were to get into a major conflagration with China, they could drop one bomb on Okinawa and wipe out 50,000 troops. So that's probably not a good idea anyway. So we're going to be moving troops around, partly to appease the Japanese government. I say we. The United States is going to move some of these troops out of there, partly to appease the Okinawans, partly to appease the Japanese government, but also just as kind of a strategic maneuver to put your forces more dispersed and in places where perhaps you need them a little bit more. Okay, now this is the interesting part to me. Where are they going to go then? So 10,000 troops are going to stay in Okinawa. By the way, they're also, they have not decided what to do about the actual air base itself outside of Futenma. That has not been decided. They just said, okay, we'll still work on moving the base. In Japan, you're going to have to pay for part of that. But to appease everybody, we'll move some troops out right now. Okay, where are they going to? Now we're getting into greater geopolitical thoughts for planet Earth. And as I've now referenced, of course, the U.S. wants to maintain its presence in the Pacific theater to counter the growing and perhaps ever more aggressive China. Specifically in that South China Sea area that I've done multiple podcasts about and talked about in class many times. An area that, surprise, surprise, is still hot in current events, where the Chinese government is facing off against the Filipino government over a small little shoal just off the coast of the Philippines that perhaps has natural gas in it. These guys have been clashing. There's Chinese warships that have been escorting off Filipino fishing ships out of this area, so that's hot. And as no coincidence, because everything's always related, friends, I think where these 9,000 troops from Okinawa are going to go are not back to the United States and not to the Middle East. They're going to go to other places in the Pacific. Other places closer, surprise, surprise, to the South China Sea. And other places. The U.S. has officially announced that some of the 9,000 are going to go to Guam. Go look that up. Little island in the middle of nowhere that's kind of a U.S. territory, I guess. Hawaii. Okay. Biggest major naval facility for the United States in Hawaii, in the Pacific Theater, is in Hawaii. So buttress up the Hawaiian stations. And this one's not so announced, but you heard it here first. They're going to go to Australia. They're going to go to Australia. If the U.S. has bases in the Philippines, I'm also going to guess that some of these folks are going to be restationed to the Philippines. I don't know that the U.S. has a big presence in the Philippines anymore. I don't know this. I'm guessing we do, and I'm also going to hypothesize we're going to have more in the future. Again, why? Because there's no real threat that China and Japan are going to go to war with each other. I mean, maybe. But there's a much greater threat because it's happening already about a face-off in the South China Sea between China and perhaps the Philippines, and China and perhaps Vietnam, and China and perhaps Indonesia or Malaysia. So the U.S., all of these are kind of U.S. allies. Malaysia, not so much so, but Indonesia, U.S. ally. Singapore, U.S. ally. Taiwan, U.S. ally. Philippines, huge U.S. ally. So those are our buddies in the hood over there, and those are the places you're probably going to see U.S. troops start to be built up in. Not in huge numbers. And that's why I got excited about this story, even though it's a buried small story in the news today, is because I've also reported in the past about these Australian bases. That a year ago, the U.S. said, hey, we're going to for the first time ever, going to station some permanent troops in a small little base in northern Australia. And that was a year ago. And everybody's like, no, it's no big deal. It's no big deal. I knew it was a big deal. I knew it was a big deal. Because it started small, as all things do. And the U.S. said, no, it's no big deal. You know, we're going to put like 20 or 30 troops in this small little naval port in northern Australia. It's nothing. And then in the last, about 6 months ago, that number got doubled. And about 2 months ago, it got doubled again. And now you have 9,000 troops that are going to be deported out of Okinawa. Wonder where they're going to go. I'll bet my last bottom dollar some of them are heading to Australia as well. So what we have is a recalibration in the Pacific of U.S. forces. Yes, it's a local Okinawa issue. Yes, it has all the trappings of kind of a local cultural clash. And it's a remnant of the World War II and perhaps a remnant of the Cold War that U.S. troops are even there. And that's fine and dandy. That's a story in and of itself. But the bigger story is where are they going to be moving to? Because that's speaking to the prioritization that the U.S. and its military are giving to where they think the oncoming possible conflicts are and where they're going to want their peeps at. So those folks may be leaving Okinawa, but they're not going to go far outside the Pacific realm of possibilities. Because I think what you're also going to see is, as we wind down troop deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're going to buttress, the U.S., is probably going to buttress their U.S. troop deployments in critical areas like the Persian Gulf. However, we're likely to move a lot more of those troops out of Central Asia altogether and to places like the Pacific Theater, which is going to be much more contested in the coming century, and even Africa. I've talked about it in the past, how the U.S. presence, military presence in Africa is just starting. It's just starting. It's a baby, but watch it grow. There is much more U.S. interest, politically, military, and economically, in those areas than there are, say, in the Korean Peninsula, or you know, Japan, or Central Asia. Do we need 100,000 U.S. troops in Central Asia? No. As soon as that Afghan campaign winds down, they're out of there. Where are they going to go? Ha! That's what I'm talking about right now. So this little negotiation here that just went down is speaking to much larger concepts. I want you to think about where the U.S. is focusing its efforts here in the 21st century, where it's going to put its military peeps. And this does come prior. There are no coincidences. Things just don't happen randomly. This story broke today probably because Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda, Noda-san, Yoshihiko is heading to Washington, D.C. next week. Again, shocker, if you follow the news and you know what's going on, there are no coincidences. So this is probably a little peace offering, a little olive branch put out there by both parties before Yoshihiko comes over to do a major powwow with U.S. President Barack Obama in just 7 days. And this is the first time that a Japanese Prime Minister has actually visited the United States for over 3 years. And that's actually a really long time to go without a meeting of the heads of state of two major allies. Major allies, U.S. and Japan. So this is kind of resetting the relationship, I think. It seems like it's going to be a win-win-win for everybody, because even though the U.S. railed against this movement of their people in this base out of Okinawa, I think the kind of longer-term perspective on this is, you know what, we probably did need to move those people out for our own reasons, not for theirs. Does that make sense? Interesting stuff, as always, in other news, reading behind the scenes of what's out there in your face in the regular press. That's all for now. Have a good day and a great weekend.